Good morning. We look at 2 Samuel 19 through 22 today. And the last four chapters of 2 Samuel, 21, 22, 23, and 24, when we get there in a bit, we won't finish it all today. But those four chapters are a little bit out of sync with kind of where we are, and it's like they're added in just to add more information. And it's, and there's a lot of times when we read in the Bible that it's not all chronological. And there are people that think, well, you start at Genesis and you read through to the end of the Old Testament, and it's all, chronological order. It is definitely not that. There's a lot of overlapping, and we're going to find that out as we get to that today. But as we left on Saturday at the end of chapter 18, we find King David weeping for his son Absalom, who was killed by David's army because Absalom was, he was pursuing David to kill David because Absalom wanted to be the king. And so we find in chapter 19 now that David is mourning for his son Absalom and just, weeping and wailing and carrying on. And Joab, the commander of the army, comes to David and says, David, you are putting guilt on every officer, every man in your army, because, he says, it almost seems like you would rather that all of us had died and your son Absalom was living. This upstart of a son of yours was, he was out for your life, and you're mourning him more than being thankful that we, the army, protected you and kept you safe. You need to go out and you need to speak with your men. You need to, go out on the balcony and have an audience with them, basically to say. And so, think about that. Joab as a commander had quite a bit of courage to go to David with that. And it's kind of like Nathan when he had to go and tell David, you're the man, But, sometimes we need to talk. We need to do that to people in authority because they don't always do the right thing and they're not always exactly perfect in all of their manners. But so David goes out and he speaks to the people, but he's a little bit upset with Joab, and so he appoints a different person, Amasa, Amasa, Amasa is what I'm going to say it, as the commander of the army, and then when we get there just a little bit, that it's kind of in the next chapter anyway, that there's a rebellion coming up, and the king says to this new commander Amasa, this is in chapter 20 verse 4, call the men of Judah together and in 3 days, and then bring yourself here. And so this is call the men of Judah together. And this is because this other upstart, a scoundrel, verse, chapter 20, verse 1, a scoundrel named Sheba, son of Birchi, a Benjamite, had said, we have no portion of David, this son of Jesse, this Bethlehemite. Let us, all of us Israelites, separate. So there's still this disparity between Judah and Israel. And it's, they've been united under King David as one, but they're still, separate identities. And so this guy rises up against David, and he gets the Israelites to turn against David and follow him, and Judah remains faithful to David. And it's because of this now then that David calls his newly appointed commander, Amasa, and he says, gather all the troops of Judah and report back in 3 days. And, Amasa kind of delayed, and he didn't come back in 3 days' time, and David was now a little bit upset with him. And so, but he finally does set out, and David doesn't speak directly to Joab, but he speaks to Joab's brother about his concerns for Amasa. And Joab's brother and Joab and all of his men then go out as well, following the men that are with Amasa to go against these Israelites that are uprising against King David. And when, verse 8 here of chapter 20, when they were at the large stone in Gibeon, Amasa came to meet them, and Joab was wearing a soldier's garment. He wasn't looking as the commander. He was just dressed as a normal soldier, and he came up to Amasa, and David had understood that, Amasa's deceit, his not being a great leader of men, and, basically the instructions were that, Joab and his brother should put an end to Amasa, and Joab did. Joab took Amasa's life. I cringe at some of this stuff, and I know you two do too, but Joab struck him and took his life, and so then now Joab is again the commander of the army, and much better that way. And it says that once Amasa was removed, the people went on after Joab in pursuit of Sheba, this upstart, this scoundrel, as it called him in the first verse here. But Joab's forces came up and besieged them in a city, and there was a woman, of the city that didn't want everybody in the city to suffer and to be killed because of this scoundrel and his men that were there, and she gets a hold of Joab, and the people of the city itself come up against Amasa and not Amasa. He's already got Sheba and his men, and the woman says to Joab, "I will throw his head over the wall to you." And then she went with the plan, and this is what happened. The people of the city, out of faithfulness to David, probably more so out of fear of total annihilation by Joab and the army, dispatched this upstart scoundrel. And so then the army and the people were again more or less united under King David. And now as we start chapter 21, again, as I said, it kind of goes back a little bit, because it talks about, there was a famine in we haven't really talked about that, we haven't really read about it, but the first part of this chapter talks about the dispatching, the killing of Saul's family and all of those, and like chapter 7, verse 7, the king spared this Mephibosheth, however, the one with the crippled feet, but the others were dispatched, and there's one, the daughter. Is verse 10, then Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it on the rock to cover and to protect the corpses of these descendants of Saul, to protect them that way. And David found out about that, and then brought Saul and Jonathan's bodies back again to be buried. And it talks about the war with the Philistines, and David becoming weary with battle, and in verse 17, it says, David's men swore to him, "You shall not go with us to battle anymore, so that you don't quench the lamp of Israel." They were beginning to fear for David's life. They didn't want David to die, because he was the lamp of Israel, the light, that he was the leader. And there were fierce battles, and there's another giant of a man with 6 fingers and 6 toes, and that was taken life that way. And so we kind of go back to a little bit of history we've kind of passed by. And then in chapter 22 is a song of David, a hymn of praise, more or less, to speak, where he's thanking God for his leadership and his deliverance and his not turning his back on him. And I didn't mention, after Nathan, the prophet, had come to David with Bathsheba and says, "You the man." I mean, we're going to read Psalms later on, but in Psalm 51, that was David's lament and hymn of praise to God for his faithfulness, and we get those words, create in me a clean heart, O God, and, you know, cast me not away from your presence, restore in me a clean heart. You know, and those words that we sing as a part of our liturgy so often in worship. And so we have in the Psalms of David so much wonderful praise and everything. But here again, in chapter 22 and the first part of chapter 23, David is praising God. You know, it starts out, the Lord is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield, the horn of my salvation. You know, he's acknowledging all of what God has done. And it's just, you know, sometimes we forget to count our blessings. And, you know, I know you've read them too and stuff, you know, rather than count our woes, we should count our blessings. Rather than, you know, look on the, you know, be upset with everything, you know, think about how blessed we really are with everything that we have. And David, you know, he forgets those things sometimes, and he gets kind of full of himself sometimes. And I mean, we see in King David, you know, an awful lot of the same things we see in ourselves. And hopefully we can find in ourselves repentant hearts and the ability to sing God's praises in the midst of everything that goes on in our lives, to know that first and foremost, God is for us and he loves us.